Welcome to a special show, Vote for Growth. Today we're going to be talking about the real estate industry, how in the last 5 years it has completely changed the skyline of the country's cities, what lies ahead for the industry, what are the challenges, and how it can ensure that the goal of building India can be better achieved in partnership with the government. And talking to me on this issue is our guest. These include Anshul Jain of DTZ, Pranav Ansal of Ansals, Sanjay Verma of Cushman & Wakefield, and Rajiv Talwar of DLF. Let's begin by assessing how much and how far the industry has come so far. Let me go for an independent analysis first with Sanjay. How would you say in the last 5 years, what are the achievements of the industry?
I think there are a huge number of positives, quite frankly, by way of contribution to GDP, job creation, changing the landscape of the country, catering to some intrinsic demands like housing. At the same time, there are some gross mistakes which have surfaced, and I take them positively because unless you tried, you won't really know what to do.
Let's focus on the achievements in the last 5 years or so. What do you think has been the single biggest achievement of the real estate sector?
I think in one word, it's to the significant contribution to the GDP growth. I mean, the India story has been doing the routes in the world for a 8 to 9% growth. 14 to 15% of that, directly or indirectly, comes from the real estate industry. It's probably one of the two largest job-creating industries in India. So that itself is a huge, huge contribution, quite frankly.
How would you say, you've been in the business for many decades now, what has been the single most exciting part of the last 5 years?
Well, I think the last 5 years have been very interesting and very exciting, and we've seen lots of new players and probably everybody jumping into the field. So I think the whole concept, the way real estate was done in terms of design, in terms of quality, in terms of deliveries has totally changed. And coming in with international IPCs, like my two friends sitting on my either side, they have changed. A lot of multinationals coming in. Earlier our dealings used to be with, not with such big corporates, and so I think it's become more global. 5 years ago we were not even considered a patch to where as to other developed countries. So I think a lot of changes, but lots is still expected.
And Rajiv, DLF has again been one of the pioneers in this concept, especially integrated townships as well. And he thought of these townships when not many thought that private townships could exist. Again, in the last 5 years, what would you think has been your company's achievement? What are the areas which you entered into which you thought was not possible a few years ago?
I think townships is again one of them. I think the maturing of Gurgaon as a satellite township of Delhi has really spoken a lot for itself. Yes, it's also become the BPO capital. So that says a large number that you can have connectivity and you can have bandwidth together, creating a new city by itself and a new lifestyle. India's skyline, if it has changed, the new generation, I think the new generation which is coming up, and the lifestyle they expect, the kind of staying places they expect, clubs, recreation, entertainment, shopping. I think all of that being put into walk-to-work culture is really the onset of the private sector in India, and it has played its role along with that of the government. Actually, if I ask you, a lot of the growth which we've been talking about, how much of it has been driven by sectors such as IT and retail, and how much has it been driven by sheer residential consumer demand?
I think it's a combination of both, Pranil. If we look at the single biggest thing that happened to the real estate sector in the last 5 years was opening of FDI and therefore creating liquidity in the sector. Now that was intended to create the real estate infrastructure which was very important to support the IT/BPO growth, because the employment was coming from there, and the money that was going into that sector in turn was filtering into the residential sector as well. It was a combination of both the jobs that were created through the IT sector, which is being put back into the residential sector.
And Pranav, did the sheer scale of demand and scale of operation, again your company has been working in the sector for decades, did that catch you by surprise? You have even a small suburb of Delhi, Ghaziabad, coming up as the mall capital of the country with a maximum per square kilometer of mall density.
See, I think one of the reasons why the market just picked up was because of mortgage finance. I think about 7-8 years ago, when the mortgage finance market just opened up, people got easy availability of money and the economy was growing. People had enough income, whether as salary or from their businesses. So the demand just spurted, and banks like SDFC and all the other banks just went all out and gave all sorts of housing loans. And I think regarding the mall frenzy, our company built the first shopping mall in the year 1999 in Delhi. And at that time, people had no concept, and we had a very difficult time just filling up that mall. And I think once that opened, everybody just, went crazy about building malls. So none of them have been built as malls, or they are called malls, but they are not malls in the mall sense of the word.
Sanjay, if I come to you, in the last 5 years, if you can give a broad picture, how much of the growth has been in sheer revenue figures or perhaps volumes, if you'd like to take any of these? How much of it has been residential and how much of it has been commercial, which would include retail and office space?
Just from a percentage standpoint, if you just look at the total built stock in past and future, residential would contribute about 70 to 80% of the total potential of the industry. In volume terms, you see, value terms you can't really say because it's a very fragmented market. But in volume terms, in a square foot basis, 80 to 90% is residential. Out of that, about 80% of that 90% is housing, which, there are various definitions, which is affordable budget. In my opinion, less than 20 lakhs. So that's really the sweet spot. Having said that, you also have to realize that the rest of the 10-15%, which is your office, shopping and hospitality, three other sectors put together, they basically are responsible for creating the demand for that housing. So it's unfair to just look at housing alone as the single biggest opportunity, because if there is no job creation, there is no office demand, then there is no purchasing power to buy a house. So housing will remain the single largest opportunity, but the overall urbanization, which includes all other sectors, I think is equally important.
So we're taking a short break over here, but once we come back, we'll talk about how the industry needs to be more transparent in its working. Stay with us for our special show, Vote for Growth. Rajiv, we talked about FDI, how that sort of really ensured liquidity for the companies in the sector, and consumer finance has ensured liquidity for the buyer. Now, if I look at the policy framework, what would you think have been the best steps taken by the government in the last few years to ensure that all the boom that we're talking about, how much of that is policy-led? I think they've realized the demand and they've responded to the demand. But when a policy framework needs to be changed, yes, I think we have to go from single property to property approvals to multiple approvals, having a single window clearance system, having so many multiplicity of authorities in every state. You've got to really go through a plethora of authorities to really get your building up. I think that if India needs to speed up, and there is a dire necessity, I think when Sanjay talked about the contribution to GDP and the employment, I think we have a huge bulge in population coming up, and that bulge is what we call the demographic advantage, that half the population is below the age of 25. Now, below the age of 25 means that for the next 25 years or 30 years, you're going to have this huge bulge increasing upwards in the population. You need to provide them housing, as you said. They need to have offices, retail spaces, leisure spaces, entertainment spaces, and therefore India's policymakers and the private sector will have to work that how do you reduce this time gap and the time lag between the conception of a building, purchase of land and final delivery to something like 18 months. And there you'll have to go hell for leather. But it's at this point, that is it just the demand and supply gap which is responsible for this price level, or was this also speculative activity by buyers aided by some developers and advisors?
I think it was a combination of both. The actual users went for the mortgage finance, but a lot of people looked at the real estate market like the stock market, and they just thought that the market will always, every day it will go up, and people are putting in 100 rupees today, expecting it to be 200 rupees in the next 1 month, which happened for actually some time because of such a great demand. But after some time, in some areas where there was oversupply, there was oversaturation, or the liquidity cycle got stuck, then the people got stuck. And that's why today this whole noise about prices slow down is being talked about because of this reason.
But Anshul, I'd like to bring you in. Did this rush and this money play, did it also encourage a lot of new developers to enter the market, people who probably didn't have enough experience to handle property and land?
Absolutely, they did. I think whoever had a source of financing available through the sort of the private or HNI sector, the high net worth individual sector, they put some money together and rushed into this. I think the problem with the...
I'm also talking about a corporate or an entrepreneur. Anybody who had a few crores to spare became a developer overnight.
It was apparently it was a shortcut to become a millionaire, and as Pranav rightly said, you can't treat property as a stock market where you invest today and get out in a month's time. It has to be a long-term play, and that's what people forget, and that's where the pain is at the moment.
Sanjay, the issue of transparency now looms large over the sector. We do have FDI in the sector, and typically whenever we've had FDI in any of the sectors, transparency has improved. Now, that's clearly a challenge for the sector. How do you see that playing out in the future?
One of the things that has happened in the last 5 years is a lot of institutional capital has started to enter the sector, which never it did. It was always used to be funded by the family or the equity of the owner or the developer. What this institutional capital does is it forces you certain degree of governance and transparency. So there has been a huge shift. Now, whether it's adequate, the jury is still out on that. But what's going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years, if you believe in the India story, which I do, if the Indian economy will relatively do better than a lot of other global economies, then we are talking about a huge amount of capital required just for the real estate sector alone. Now, all that capital is not available in the country. It will come from other parts of the world, other sectors, other investors. Institutional capital will ensure and force the companies to go transparent. So it's not my big concern, quite frankly. You won't have to push it. However, it can be facilitated and can be accelerated if there is a federal body which works as a facilitator of implementing policy governance. I've always quoted the example of Telecom Regulatory Authority, something like that, which becomes a platform to create awareness, to bring everybody together, not just the developers, not just the investors, not just the consumers, everybody.
If there were a regulator to be set up today, what would you say the charter for that body should be?
You need to understand the need for it's in a layman's language. Why do you need to be non-transparent? Many a times, if there is over-governance, people try to be non-transparent. I think a body needs to look at the degree of governance or regulation in the industry. In some places, it's overly regulated. For example, the whole process of acquiring land, converting it, and getting the license, I think is over-regulated. You have to go to 35 people to get an approval to start your building.
So at one level,
ridiculous.
So that's what Raji was saying. At one level, you have over-regulation.
Yeah.
At another level, you have no regulation.
Now, how the land should be valued. A lot of people shoot the messenger. We indulge in valuations. Let's set up a procedure. Let's set up a method. Let everybody come together on our platform, because let me tell you this opportunity is so big. I don't think anybody wants to make money on the sly in this industry. And I think this industry needs a little bit respect and commitment from the government to treat it like that. You can't just use it for a convenience. So when it contributes, you say, oh, that's fine, this is an industry.
That's the key word which you use, respect. I'm going to come back to it.
And I'll tell you what, today, if you look at no offense to you, today I read the newspapers, I see a little bit of a sadistic element in saying, oh, someone is going to go bankrupt, or someone is going to, I think it's a little unfair given the size of this industry. Yes, does it need improvement in governance, transparency? Absolutely, yes. Look at the history. There are, how many firms listed have a trading history of more than 20 years? So how will you, it has to learn, it's evolving. All the more reason for everybody to support it.
But here, I think that's the biggest achievement of the last 5 years. The number of real estate companies which have gone public. Because by that, your accounts go public, they get scrutinized, then your valuations are actually perception driven by the public. And it will evolve.
Getting listed, getting capital for institutions teaches you to be disciplined. You have no choice.
And the larger the number of players who are entering, and the more that they go public. But because I'm not completely in resonance with this issue, but do you think a federal regulator will work for the industry, for a sector which has so many state laws as well? Hopefully, if it reduces the number of agencies that if you have to go to, if it becomes just one more agency, then unfortunately in the government every new agency sees their role as yet another.
Can a Septem-like episode happen in real estate? Yes. Will you wait for it to happen? That's the question.
Are you think it's waiting to happen?
No. The point is you don't do anything. I mean, status quo is not the answer. It is a newfound industry. It is in the early stages of growth. Fortunately or unfortunately, it has seen tremendous amount of growth in the last 5 years. Now, someone's got to step in. The government's job is to govern. Now, governance is required in this industry. In what shape or form, that is something that we all need to debate and come about.
I mean, that's a fair point, but we're taking a short break here, but once we return, we'll put this question to all our panelists. What are the steps that the industry and the government must take to ensure that the growth story does not fade away? Stay with us. Can't the industry govern itself?
See, the problem is some of the companies do govern themselves, but the problem is when you have the entire sector, and there are, in India even today, the unorganized sector does more development, produces more homes than the organized sector. So till we don't get a regulatory body, which is what we've been talking about for several years, and the government always talks about it, and nothing happens. Like Mr. Talwar was mentioning, how to get approvals, because the problem is, as developers, we are half our life goes struggling in getting approvals from the state government authorities. If it's just another add-on, then probably we don't want it. But if the government wants the sector to grow and survive, and without which the economy cannot grow, so the government has to realize the importance of the sector, and not to, like nowadays, the sector is being witch hunted by the media. That's what and I'm happy to say it on air. So every day, like Sanjay just said, that if you want another something to be happening, the government has to realize the importance of the sector.
Now, I find your suggestion of can the industry govern itself intriguing. Imagine if there was no SEBI in India and there was no SEC in the US, how many Enrons and Satyam would happen? That would answer your question. Some of the suggestions, I'll just give one suggestion.
There's still something called NASSCOM for the software industry, which ensure that a basic benchmark of behavior.
See, that's a good example. That's a good example. So at least have a body. A lot of people say you can't have a regulator.
That's not a regulator.
No. That's why I said a facilitating platform. TRAI is not a regulator. It's a recommending body. That's why I give that example. A lot of people say you can't have a regulator because it's a state subject. But is there a body which facilitates discussion? I'll give you just one example, Pranjal, which is, and I disagree that only the government needs to be blamed. The developer body, the investors, everybody. For example, we just need one regulation in place, that if you are taking advance for a project, you need to create an escrow, and that money will only be used to buy cement, steel for that project or land. Today, the biggest lack of confidence a consumer has is they paid money and that there is no construction. If all that money, and that's how it happens all over the world, this single regulation and commitment by all the developers will bring back consumer confidence more than what you require in a newspaper.
That's the key issue, because one of the fundamental problems in the industry is the flow of unaccounted money, and this happens at the consumer level and at the corporate level as well. So in a way, it has actually saved the real estate industry, because whatever happens, because there's unaccountable black money component of every residential transaction, at least there's some cash flow, unlike what's happened in the West, in the US, where there was actually emotional money floating around and there was no actual money. Raji, my question to you is, can we hope for these changes until this fundamental way of doing business in real estate, especially for residential, these have already happened, in fact, in the country. They're taking place. When you said unaccounted money, I think we're talking of a larger economy in this country, and it's not just the real estate sector. In fact, the more the companies go public, the less the flow of unaccounted money, because they can't afford to have unaccounted money. All your funds are supposed to be regulated, all your funds are supposed to be scrutinized, accounted for. Yes, they would go into projects which are meant and for which you collect the funds. Therefore, there can be no, in fact, it should be an encouragement from industry as well, and as from the government, that yes, let us go in and make as many companies to go public, and then institutional finance to step in. I think if you make working capital easier, if you make institutional finance easier, and that's where you had a large amount of FDI flowing in earlier, according to government guidelines for long term, because those were the people who were willing to take a risk. And Indian rates have suddenly gone too high, and you made a policy change sitting somewhere back 3 years or 4 years ago, that we need to control inflation by actually what is mentioned in the newspapers and media today, that ringing up individual banks to say don't fund. Today the position is just the opposite. I think we need to have a mindset that basically development and growth is not only desirable, it's critical for India. So we're running out of time now, so I'm going to put this basic question to all of you in summary. If the industry has to continue to grow, continue to get respect and become far more efficient, what would you suggest as key changes which the policy framework and the industry have to do? I'll put this question to all of you and then we'll end this.
Treated as an industry from a financing point of view. When we had FDI, a lot of liquidity came in and the whole thing developed, right? Today, if you make funds available at the right interest rate, at a competitive interest rate, not necessarily subsidized.
And I think a good parallel is the movie industry, because it moved from completely unaccounted money to very organized money.
And that will then remove your unaccounted money, that will remove your private investors in this, and that will help the whole industry behave in a more industry-like fashion. I think that's the key change that needs to be brought in. Treated as an industry, provided the right amount of financing for the right tenure. You can't compare it with an XYZ industry. The tenures have to be longer in the real estate industry.
I think, of course, we've all been asking for industry status for a while. And I think there has to be a time frame with the governments as to how soon they approve our, the various permissions we get. I think there should be a time frame on that. Time frame on us as well as the governments, and both should be equally accountable. I think that is extremely critical for working for developers.
Because we are in an unsettled world today, a short-term response is required, and because this industry is so important and big, a long-term response is required. And response is required from government, developers and consumers.
Can you summarize?
Yeah, from the government, the short-term response is only one: liquidity. If they don't address that problem, there won't be any industry to save. That is a bigger problem today than demand. The long-term response from the government is not to make policies, but to have a body which then can facilitate policy change. On the developers front, I think the short-term response is realign your margins. It's better to be in business than wait for a big margin. So I think price correction is not a choice today. Long-term response, they need to realize that financial engineering is not a substitute for civil engineering. So focus on organization, building, execution. And from consumers, short-term responses, no need to panic. This is a global problem, and I think India is better poised than any other country to survive. Long-term response, become more aware and educated, and don't go with the flow when it comes to industries like these.
I think you summed up very well, but I'll just add one word to it, which you used, which is respect. I think each one of the players, whether it's the government, whether it's the industry, or whether it's the consumer, need to respect each other. Very often, I think media plays the role of a facilitator in it. It's natural Indian-born skepticism that we always say, okay, now what do we find what is going wrong? I think if we treat each one of these four institutions with respect, a lot of these misunderstandings would go away, a lot of policy changes will come in, whether in the shorter term or in the longer term. And I think we'll have a much better growth story, because India is the growth story of this century, and hopefully each one of us, whether it's older or whether it's younger, need to do that. We need to make it true. Thanks, Rajan. Thanks very much for joining us.